few months ago, I was house sitting and dog sitting for my parents in their quiet suburban home in Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the Pacific Northwest. As a 24-year-old woman with an unhealthy obsession with true crime documentaries and horror films, I often found myself jumping at shadows. But this time, the unease I felt was different, deeper, more persistent. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling lingered like a fog I couldn't shake. During those days, I noticed something strange about my parents' dog, a golden retriever named Max. Max was usually a laid-back, predictable dog, but suddenly he began acting oddly. Every time I took him outside, he would sniff intently around the perimeter of the house, particularly under the windows. His behavior was so unusual that I decided to investigate. That's when I saw them, two large, muddy footprints beneath the living room window, which offered a direct view into the house. My stomach dropped. Someone had been standing there, watching. Around the same time, I began noticing a man I'd never seen before in our tight-knit community. He was tall, with a gaunt face and a worn-out gray jacket that hung loosely on his frame. He would pace up and down our street, his movements deliberate and unnerving. What struck me most was the way he stared. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He never smiled, never waved, never acknowledged my attempts at polite greetings. Instead, he would crane his neck as he walked by, as if trying to peer into the windows of the house. His presence felt invasive, like a shadow that didn't belong. One afternoon, fed up with his unsettling behavior, I decided to confront him in my own way. As he passed by, I waved aggressively, my frustration boiling over. When he didn't respond, I stood up and began walking toward him, pretending to follow. His pace quickened immediately, and he turned sharply down an alley, disappearing from sight. I never saw him again after that, but the memory of his cold, unflinching stare stayed with me. Fast forward to today. My parents were out of town again, and I offered to pick up Max from the groomer, which was just a few blocks away in our supposedly safe neighborhood. I'm usually pretty relaxed about locking doors when I'm running quick errands, but something felt off the moment I stepped back into the house. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. A throw blanket on the couch seemed slightly askew, and the faintest scent of something metallic hung in the air. Trying to calm my nerves, I decided to throw a load of laundry into the washing machine in the basement. As I stood at the top of the stairs, I hesitated, my heart pounding. I scanned the room, but everything appeared normal. No one was there. I told myself I was being ridiculous and headed to the bathroom to check my makeup in the mirror. That's when I saw it. In the toilet, unflushed and devoid of any toilet paper, was a pile of feces. My breath caught in my throat. I had been the only one home all morning. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. No one in my family would ever leave the bathroom in such a state. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside the house. Panic surged through me. I yanked back the shower curtain, half expecting to find someone hiding there, but the tub was empty. My hands trembled as I locked the bathroom door behind me and called 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until the police arrived, which took less than 2 minutes. 2 officers searched the house thoroughly, their flashlights cutting through the dim corners of every room. They checked the windows, the doors, and even asked me to review my laptop's search history to see if anything unusual had been accessed. They even inspected the fridge, looking for signs of missing food. Everything seemed to be in place, except for the undeniable evidence in the bathroom. The officers were polite but skeptical. They asked if I had any history of anxiety or paranoia, and I couldn't help but feel like they were dismissing my concerns because of my love for true crime and horror. But I knew what I saw. I knew someone had been in the house, and I knew they had left that grotesque calling card as a reminder of their presence. Since that day, I've been on edge. I keep my dad's hunting knife, a sturdy Phillips blade within arm's reach at all times. The thought of someone lurking outside, watching, waiting, is enough to make my blood run cold. Whoever you are, whatever you want, let's not meet. Not now, not ever. First, let me clarify a few things. Since much of Reddit's audience is American, and given the current climate of division over law enforcement, some supporting the police, others vehemently against them, I don't want this story to come across as an attack on all officers. This incident took place in Morocco, and like anywhere else, there are good and bad individuals in every profession. The title might seem odd at first, but as the story unfolds, it will make sense. About 8 or 9 years ago, I was 21, a young Moroccan man studying engineering during the grueling final season. I was surviving on caffeine, sleepless nights, and zero self-care. My beard had grown into an unkempt mess, and my hair was a wild tangle of curls. I looked like I hadn't seen the sun in weeks. This detail is crucial because it sets the stage for what happened next. A little background. Around 15 years ago, there was a political faction in Morocco called the Justice and Unity Movement. They were known for their strict religious ideologies, and their members often sported long beards and traditional attire. After a series of political upheavals, the government labeled them as extremists, and anyone associated with them, or even resembling them, was targeted. This meant that if you had a long beard or appeared overly religious, you were at risk of being detained, interrogated, or worse. Fast forward to my 21-year-old self, stressed out of my mind, trying to cram for my engineering finals. I was running late, my notes clutched in my hands, my mind racing as I muttered equations under my breath. I was a walking disaster, and the last thing I needed was an interruption. But as I hurried down the narrow, dusty streets of Casablanca, a man in plain clothes stepped in front of me and told me to stop. I ignored him. I was late, panicked, and couldn't afford to lose focus. He raised his voice, claiming he was a police officer. My heart sank. I demanded to see his ID, but he brushed me off, saying, "Just come with me." My mind spiraled. What had I done? Was I being arrested? What about my exam? And what if this guy wasn't even a cop? Before I could process it, he grabbed my arm and started dragging me. I screamed for help, my voice echoing through the street, but the few people around just stared and walked away. No one intervened. The man tightened his grip, locking his elbow around my neck, and hauled me into an abandoned cafe. My thoughts raced. This is it. I'm going to disappear, and no one will ever know what happened to me. I started whispering prayers under my breath, my voice trembling. Inside the cafe, a group of men in civilian clothes sat around a table. One of them, who seemed to be in charge, barked at me, "Shut up, or we'll take you in for questioning. Your choice." I was shaking, on the verge of tears. They took my ID and began running checks on me. I kept pleading, explaining that I had an exam I couldn't miss. One of the officers, surprisingly, showed me a bit of kindness. He asked about my studies, flipped through my notes, and even joked about how stressful finals were. It was a small comfort, but it didn't ease the dread gnawing at me. Then they brought in another man, older, with a beard so long it reached his chest. They interrogated him about the Justice and Unity movement, his voice quivering as he denied any involvement. That's when it clicked. They thought my unkempt beard and disheveled appearance made me a suspect. They turned to me and demanded to know why I'd grown my beard. I stammered, "I've been too busy studying. I haven't had time to shave." They pressed further, asking if I had any family or friends tied to the movement. I insisted I didn't, that my family kept to themselves and avoided politics altogether. Desperate to prove I wasn't a threat, I handed over my phone. My playlist was filled with punk rock and heavy metal, genres often misunderstood in my country, sometimes associated with rebellion or even heresy. To my relief, they didn't accuse me of anything. They just seemed confused. After what felt like an eternity, they finished their checks and handed back my ID. Then, the supervisor asked me a question that left me speechless. "Why did you scream for help earlier?" I couldn't exactly say it was because they'd manhandled me, so I lied and told them I'd been mugged before. They laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl. I apologized to the supervisor, knowing this had happened just a few blocks from where I lived. The last thing I needed was to become a target. By the time I made it to the exam hall, I was an hour late. The invigilator wouldn't let me in with my notes, so in a fit of frustration, I tossed them into a trash bin and walked in. I tried to focus, but my mind kept replaying the humiliation, the fear, the helplessness. I managed to answer most of the questions, but my focus was shattered. I barely passed that exam. Even now, years later, the memory haunts me. The powerlessness I felt, the realization that I couldn't have done anything differently, it's a bitter pill to swallow. It's a reminder that in certain situations, unless you have influence or power, you're at the mercy of those who do. This happened nearly a decade ago, but it feels like yesterday. And every time I think about it, I'm reminded of how fragile our sense of safety can be. I was one of those kids you'd spot at places like zoos or theme parks, tethered to a parent by a leash. Back then, over 2 decades ago, leashes weren't as common as they are now, and they were usually just simple straps looped around a child's wrist. In my case, it wasn't just a precaution, it was a necessity. I had a habit of wandering off, no matter where we were or what was happening around me. My curiosity always seemed to override my sense of caution. This is one of the incidents that convinced my mom I needed that leash. It happened when I was 7 years old, during a trip to the zoo with my mom and 2 older sisters. Before every outing, my mom would give me the same stern lecture about staying close and not straying from the group. She was a no-nonsense single mother of 3, and she always followed through on her warnings. That day, I started off well-behaved, sticking close to my family as we wandered through the zoo. But then, something caught my eye, a brightly colored exhibit filled with exotic birds and fluttering butterflies. Without thinking, I drifted away, completely absorbed by the vibrant display. By the time I realized I was alone, panic set in. I wasn't just scared of being lost. I was terrified of how furious my mom would be when she found me. In my frantic state, I convinced myself that if I could just find her car and wait there, everything would be fine. So I left the zoo and started wandering through the surrounding neighborhood. Nothing looked familiar, and the streets felt eerily quiet. My heart raced as I realized I had no idea where I was. Tears streamed down my face as I imagined my mom's reaction. That's when he appeared, a man in his late 40s, with a friendly smile and a calm demeanor. He approached me and asked if I was lost. Relieved to see someone who might help, I explained that I'd gotten separated from my family at the zoo and was trying to find my way back. He nodded sympathetically and told me he'd just come from the zoo himself. He claimed he'd seen a family near the entrance, searching for a little girl with brown hair and a red jacket. But then he said something that made my stomach twist. "You're still a few blocks away. Why don't we take my car? It'll be faster." The mention of his car sent a chill down my spine. I shook my head and told him I wasn't allowed to get into cars with strangers. He chuckled softly and said, "You're a smart kid, aren't you? You can tell when someone's trustworthy, right?" His tone was gentle, but something about it felt off. Then he added, "I actually spoke to your parents earlier. They're really worried about you." That's when I froze. My dad had passed away 2 years ago, and the man's words didn't make sense. I asked him, "You talked to my dad?" He hesitated for a moment before nodding. That's when I broke down crying, overwhelmed by confusion and fear. My sobbing caught the attention of a security guard patrolling a nearby parking garage. He approached us and asked if everything was okay. The man quickly stepped forward, explaining that I was his daughter and we were looking for my mom. The security guard seemed to buy his story at first, even pointing us in the direction of the zoo. But as the man took my hand and started to lead me away, the guard hesitated. He crouched down to my level and asked gently, "Why are you still crying, sweetheart?" I choked out, "My dad's dead." The guard's expression shifted instantly. He stood up and turned to the man, his voice firm. "Is this your daughter?" The man stammered. No, I never said that. I'm just helping her find her family." But the guard wasn't convinced. He told the man he'd take it from here, and the guy quickly walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The security guard stayed with me, calling the zoo to confirm my story. He walked me back to the entrance, where my mom and sisters were waiting in the security office. My mom was furious, but her anger quickly melted into relief when she saw me. She hugged me tightly, scolding me through tears. Looking back, I realize how close I came to something unthinkable. That security guard's instincts saved me that day. I'll always be grateful for his quick thinking and the extra moment he took to ask me that one crucial question. It's a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how one small decision can change everything. Things were off from the start. A young woman named Lydia called 911, her voice trembling as she claimed someone was inside her house. We responded immediately, arriving at her modest home just after sunset. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as we searched every corner, every closet, every shadow. But we found nothing. No intruder, no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. Normally, this wouldn't be unusual. Elderly individuals living alone sometimes experience paranoia or hallucinations as their minds deteriorate. But Lydia was only 26, far too young for dementia or similar conditions. Her fear was palpable, her hands shaking as she spoke to us. She wasn't acting. Something was wrong, but we couldn't figure out what. We told her to call us again if anything happened and left, feeling uneasy. The next day we got another call from her. This time, her voice was even more frantic. We rushed back to her house, but something felt different the moment we stepped inside. The air was heavier, the walls seemed closer together, and the layout of the rooms felt off. My partner Marcus noticed it too. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. We didn't mention it to Lydia, though. Instead, we searched the house again and once more found nothing. But then Lydia stopped us. "I recorded him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled out her phone and showed us a video. The footage was grainy, but it was unmistakable. Lydia was running through her house, her breathing ragged, when a figure appeared. A tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in a black bodysuit that covered him completely, even his face. He moved unnaturally, his steps slow and deliberate as he lumbered toward the camera. Lydia screamed and ducked into a room, locking the door. The video ended with the sound of heavy banging on the door, followed by retreating footsteps. We were stunned. How had this man gotten in? The front door was locked when we arrived, and Lydia swore she hadn't left the room after locking herself in. Did he have a key? The thought sent a chill down my spine. We decided to keep watch on her house that night, parking a block away in my unmarked car. Marcus and I stayed alert, our eyes glued to the house. At 2:17 a.m., we saw someone walking toward the house. But it wasn't the man in the bodysuit, it was Lydia. She moved slowly, almost mechanically, her head down as she approached her own front door. Marcus and I exchanged a look. "What the hell?" he whispered. We got out of the car and followed her, knocking on the door when she disappeared inside. No answer. The lights inside flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows through the windows. Then my radio crackled. Dispatch informed us that Lydia had called 911 again, this time claiming there were multiple people in her house. They asked if we needed backup. "Yes," I said without hesitation. We forced the door open and entered, guns drawn. The living room lights continued to flicker, but no one was near the switch. The house was silent, unnaturally so. We called out for Lydia, but there was no response. As we searched the house, Marcus suddenly stopped. "There's an extra room," he said, his voice tight. "Last time, there were 8 rooms. Now there are 9. I frowned, trying to recall the layout. He was right. The basement, which had only 1 door before, now had 2. My stomach churned. Something was very wrong. Then we heard it. A knock on the front door. It was loud, insistent. We looked out the window but saw no one. My radio crackled again. Dispatch relayed a message from Lydia. "You're gonna die," she said in a flat, emotionless tone. The knocking stopped, but footsteps echoed from the basement. Something was down there. We decided to leave, but as we turned to go, Lydia appeared in the hallway. Her eyes were blank, her expression vacant. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "I think he's in the basement. Why don't you check?" She gestured toward the basement door, her arm moving stiffly, like a marionette. The footsteps below grew louder, faster, as if whatever was down there was running in circles. We didn't wait. We pushed past her and bolted out the front door. Backup still hadn't arrived, so we ran to the car. That's when we saw him, the man in the black bodysuit. He was standing by the driver's side window, his featureless face turned toward us. Marcus shouted at him to step back, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he lunged toward us with terrifying speed, disappearing into the house before we could react. When backup finally arrived, they swarmed the house. A man in a suit, someone we'd never seen before, questioned us. He asked strange, specific questions. How many doors were there? Did you see a man with one eye? What color were Lydia's eyes? We answered as best we could, but nothing made sense. At one point, we saw SWAT members carrying stretchers out of the house, loading them into a black van instead of an ambulance. The man in the suit told us to go home and act as if nothing had happened. Marcus and I drove back to the station in silence. As we parked, Marcus suddenly said, "Miguel's lost it, man." I stared at him. "Who's Miguel?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "The guy who owns the house. How do you not remember?" My blood ran cold. "It was Lydia," I said. "A woman named Lydia." We stared at each other, neither of us willing to say more. That night, as I tried to sleep, the phone rang. It was dispatch. "We need you. A woman called 911, says someone's in her house." My heart sank when they gave me the address. It was Lydia's. I hung up and stared at the ceiling, knowing this nightmare was far from over. This happened to me just a few nights ago, and I'm still reeling from the experience. My name is Clara, and I work as a bartender at a cozy little spot called the Rusty Lantern, a cafe by day and a lively venue by night. During the day, we serve artisanal coffee and homemade pastries, but once the sun sets, the place transforms into a bar with live music, poetry readings, and comedy nights. It's usually a warm, welcoming space, but that night, it felt anything but. It was a chilly Thursday evening in late October, and we were hosting an open mic comedy night. Unfortunately, only a handful of comedians showed up, and the crowd was thin. By 10:30 p.m., we decided to close early. I was exhausted and eager to get home, but little did I know, the night was far from over. Earlier in the evening, a man had come in and ordered a single beer. He looked to be in his late 30s, with unkempt brown hair and a worn leather jacket. He introduced himself as Jeffrey, though something about the way he said it made me doubt it was his real name. He seemed jittery, constantly glancing around the room and fidgeting with his hands. I didn't think much of it at first. I've dealt with plenty of nervous patrons over the years. Some people just get anxious in social settings, especially around women. He sat at the far end of the bar, sipping his drink and occasionally chuckling at the comedians, though his laughter always felt forced. By the time we closed, the place was nearly empty. I ushered out the last few stragglers, a young couple who lingered by the door, laughing and sharing a cigarette. As I turned to lock up, I noticed Jeffrey walking down the dimly lit hallway toward the men's restroom. I thought nothing of it, until less than a minute later, he came bursting out, his face pale and his voice frantic. "Clara, you need to come quick!" "The toilet's overflowing. There's water everywhere," he shouted, his voice trembling. I froze. Something about his tone set off alarm bells in my head. I stayed at the far end of the hallway, about 20 feet away, and called back. "It's okay, Jeffrey. These things happen. I'll grab the mop and clean it up in a minute. I'm just trying to close up." But he wasn't having it. "No, you don't understand. It's bad. Really bad. You need to come see this," he insisted, his voice rising with each word. He took a step toward me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I held up my hands, signaling for him to stop. "Jeffrey, I'll handle it. Just give me a second, okay?" He didn't listen. Instead, he started walking toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he was just a few feet away, he lunged forward, reaching for my arm. "You need to come back here now," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. I recoiled, my heart pounding. "Get out!" I snapped, my voice shaking but firm. "Leave, or I'm calling the police." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out the front door. I locked it behind him, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. Once he was gone, I hurried to the restroom to assess the damage. But when I pushed open the door, everything was perfectly normal. The floor was dry, the toilet and urinal were functioning fine, and there was no sign of any flooding. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. He had lied. But why? I didn't have time to dwell on it. I grabbed my pocket knife from behind the bar and clipped it to my belt, just in case. As I cleaned the espresso machine and restocked the liquor bottles, I tried to shake off the unease creeping over me. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the front window. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. Jeffrey was standing outside, his face pressed against the glass. He was grinning, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, almost predatory. He waved at me, his movements slow and deliberate before rapping on the window again. Then, without warning, he lunged at the door, yanking on the handle with all his might. When it didn't budge, he started pounding on the glass, his face contorted with rage. "Open the damn door, Clara!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the empty cafe. "I'm going to kill you! Do you hear me? I'm going to kill you!" My fight instinct kicked in. I grabbed my knife and stepped out from behind the bar, stopping about 6 feet from the door. I locked eyes with him and shouted, "I've already called the cops. Get the hell out of here before they show up." For a moment, he just stared at me, his chest heaving. Then, to my horror, he started laughing, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. He took a step back, still grinning, and disappeared into the shadows. I waited, my heart racing, but the police never came. After an hour and a half, I called my boyfriend, Marcus, who rushed over to the cafe. My manager, Sarah, monitored the security cameras from home, making sure Jeffrey didn't return. I finished closing up as quickly as I could, my hands still shaking, and drove home with Marcus following close behind. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling of being watched. Marcus has been coming to work with me to make sure I'm never alone, and Sarah keeps a close eye on the cameras whenever I'm on shift. But every time I hear a strange noise or see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Jeffrey is still out there, waiting for his next chance. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, I pray I never see him again. When I was around 14 or 15, let me give you some context. The legal drinking age in my country was 19 at the time. If you didn't have a fake ID or an older sibling to buy alcohol for you, your only option was to loiter outside the corner shop, or liquor store for those across the pond, and hope a kind stranger would agree to purchase it for you. One evening, my friends and I managed to convince a passerby to buy us a couple of bottles of rum. There were 3 of us, me, my best friend Lila, and her cousin Marcus. We were supposed to meet up with a few others later that night. It was around 7:30 p.m. and the streets were bustling. We knew it was too risky to pour the rum into water bottles out in the open, so we did what we always did in these situations, ducked into a nearby fast food joint to use the restroom. This time, we chose a Burger King a few blocks away. We'd done this before at the same location, so we felt confident it was a safe spot. We hurried inside, bypassing the counter, and made a beeline for the bathroom. The 3 of us crammed into one stall, trying to work quickly. As we were transferring the rum, I heard a faint shuffling noise above us. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around in the ceiling. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just the ventilation system or a rat. I didn't mention it to Lila or Marcus because I didn't want to spook them. We were almost done when we heard a soft, muffled laugh. Then a voice whispered, "Hey, what are you kids up to?" I froze. Slowly, I looked up and saw a pair of bloodshot eyes peering down at us through a slightly shifted ceiling tile. The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, with greasy hair and a crooked grin, was lying flat on his stomach, staring directly at us. "You girls having fun?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. I was presenting as female back then. He chuckled again, his breath reeking of stale cigarettes. "What's your names? Where you headed? Can I come along?" We were paralyzed with fear. Who the hell expects to find a grown man lurking in the ceiling of a Burger King bathroom? My heart was pounding, but I tried to act tough. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I snapped. "Get lost, you creep!" He seemed to find this hilarious, laughing even harder as he shifted around above us, his eyes never leaving ours. To make matters worse, we had a couple of pre-rolled joints tucked into my bag, and the last thing we wanted was to draw attention to ourselves. The man kept asking invasive questions. "How old are you? Where do you live? Can I have a sip of that rum? Maybe a hit of your weed?" His voice was unnervingly calm, but his movements were erratic, like he was barely holding himself together. Then, he started lifting the ceiling tile higher, as if he was preparing to drop down into the stall with us. That was our cue to leave. We bolted out of the stall and rushed outside, our hearts racing. Once we caught our breath, we debated what to do. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, and I kept thinking about all the women and children who might use that bathroom later. I decided to go back inside and tell a staff member, but I was terrified of getting in trouble for the alcohol and weed. So I concocted a flimsy excuse. I told an employee that I'd been in the bathroom taking a phone call when I noticed a man in the ceiling. To my shock, the staff didn't seem surprised. In fact, they looked more annoyed than anything. A couple of male employees went into the bathroom, and I assumed they'd handle it. I didn't stick around to find out what happened. We never saw the man again, and we never heard anything about him being caught. For all we know, he could still be up there, watching, waiting. To the creepy guy in the Burger King ceiling, I hope our paths never cross again. But if they do, I won't be so polite next time.